Hey y'all, we need to talk about Godzilla. So, for those of you who don't know, I'm an American college student studying Japanese. Okay, pretext to myself, done. So, what does that mean? Well, along with the language, I have to watch and consume a lot of Japanese media from various points in times, including, recently, the 1954 film Godzilla, or Godzilla in English. Now, I want to say first and foremost that modern Godzilla, particularly Americanized Godzilla, is a completely different story that I'm not going to delve into because I don't particularly care about it, and I haven't seen a Godzilla movie in at least a decade. Last that I knew, according to, I think, like the 1994 movie, Godzilla was actually a girl and had babies, I think. I don't know. It's unimportant. But, okay, so why does the 1950s film that's, like, pretty hard to access for Americans matter, like, in the least? Well, in its origins, it's actually an intensely deep and moving film about so much more than just a big scary-ass lizard. これは田中智之です。ゴジラのプロデューサーですね。And he is an absolute mad lad. Okay, so imagine the scene of 1954 Japan. This is a country that 9 years prior had been decimated on various fronts after 15 years of war and suffering the only wartime atomic bombings in human history. The government doesn't want to talk about it. They want to move on. The people are hurting. Everyone has lost someone, or everyone in some cases. There's a sense in the air that things are going to be different forever. You're technically between the Soviets and the US in the middle of the Cold War, and both nations are actively testing nuclear weapons in the ocean in which your island is. Hell, fucking Korea, land y'all used to own, has been ravaged by civil war sponsored by these two very powers. And with all the stress and anxiety about the effects of nuclear proliferation and the possibilities of what the future might hold, Tanaka manages to push out a film that is critical of the use of atomic weapons. Sure, it can't directly talk about the effects and damages caused by the bombings, nor the anxiety surrounding it, but it still manages to push an allegory so strongly that contemporary audiences reportedly left the theaters crying. Godzilla was filmed for much longer and for much more money than the norm in post-war Japanese cinema. Its budget would have been about $175,000 or 62 million yen, which was dwarfed, absolutely dwarfed, by Hollywood budgets at the time. It was meant to be a blockbuster. It was meant to be a serious film, and it was, at least in Japan. The emotional ties people felt to Godzilla were reminiscent of the ties they felt to politics, and the stressors invading their everyday lives. It was a way to validate the feelings of stress and loss that so many Japanese citizens felt in the aftermath of the war. And yet, what is it that we think of today when we think of Godzilla here in America? We think of just like the most generic monster film that you can imagine. Like I said, I haven't been really interested in watching a Godzilla film in years. And even when I was assigned it recently for my class, I put it off till last minute. I had no real interest in watching it, and yet, when I did watch it, it felt like an actual movie to me. Something that had characters I could at least mildly care about, unlike all of the Americanized versions. It had solid reasons behind his awakening. Why did Godzilla wake up? He had been living peacefully in the ocean. So what changed? The use of the atomic, and in the film specifically the hydrogen bombs, essentially damaged and angered this otherwise peaceful creature. He's not destroying for the utter sake of destruction. No, he's dishing out revenge and retribution. Humanity, with its destruction of the environment as well, has cataclysmically injured the king of monsters. And with the deformation of his physical body, so too does his willingness to ignore us get warped by anger and pain. One of my favorite details in the production of the film has to do with the actual image of Godzilla himself. The look of the monster was obviously derived from dinosaurs. It says in the film quite blatantly that Godzilla is a dinosaur that has managed to survive all this time, all the way back 2 million years ago in the Jurassic. But more than just the Tyrannosaurus Rex and Stegosaurus that he draws inspiration from, there is one last bit of significance in this. His skin is scarred. It's warped, twisted in a way, burnt and dried out, in a way that is an eerie echo of the lesions and burns on the body of those racked with the effects of the atomic bombs of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, or at least those who survived. His entire being is made of burnt scar tissue. There are a lot more things I could go into regarding this film. It was seen as a genuine horror film at the time, and all things considered, I can see why, at least for Japanese audiences. But there's one thing that I've kind of hinted at here that I should finally get around to. American audiences never had the chance to react to Godzilla, at least not as it was intended. See, American audiences received a copy more or less of the film a few years later, in the form of the 1956 Godzilla, King of the Monsters. And while it was intended originally to be a remake, redub, etc. for American audiences, what was presented instead is what would lead to the legacy that Godzilla now has throughout American audiences. The film was gutted. I would argue that this was just a result of the Cold War. The Korean War having finished only a few years prior and the Cuban Revolution in full swing, anything that was seen as critical of American culture, even if it was not directly attacking it, would have been deemed communist, or at least deemed as a threat to the American way or the American dream, or what have you. So, what was meant to be a thought-provoking allegorical film about nuclear escalation and the potential environmental and societal harms caused by said usage of weaponry was instead presented as a meaningless monster flick. One that had no real clear history, no societal ties, simply a big bad monster dragging itself out of the sea in order to inflict damage for the sake of damage. And really, this is pretty telling of the American system itself as well, though. The government gets to a point where any sort of criticism is seen as an attack, thus ensuring that issues are not dealt with when they remain minor. The issue then grows and grows until others end up resenting or even openly attacking us, because we have seemingly ignored, in some cases, decades of warnings for no apparent reason. A parallel could be drawn towards our interventionist policies in the Cold War and post-Cold War eras. Our need to make ourselves some sort of police force has led people across the globe to sternly dislike us, or even hate us. And because we are utterly convinced that we are on the right side of things, any criticism or suggestion of how we might do things differently is either ignored or met with hostility. We seem to be convinced that there is only one way of doing things, the American way, without really realizing that any time we do something some sort of way, that way then technically becomes the American way. As of now, it has become the American way to bomb and drone strike civilians across the Middle East and Africa, out of fear that they one day may do us harm. But I'm willing to bet that if we just first didn't bomb them, or their parents, or their grandparents, and had instead left them to their lives of, say, agriculture and artisanry, they never would have picked up that gun in order to keep us out of their country in the first place. In the same way that we had not set off the bomb that eradicated and injured Godzilla in the first place, never would have he felt the need to leave his peaceful maritime life in search of retribution and destruction. Yeah, thank you so much for listening and watching. I really can't tell you how much it means. This is basically just an example of the kind of content that I would like to be putting out on a regular basis. So my socials will be down below, obviously, as well as my Patreon. If you are